So the floor is now open for questions. Do we have to have people? Oh, you have a microphone, hand mic there. Yes.
Okay, I have a question for Michael in particular, but for everyone on the panel. We're in the middle of this process of organizing New York City, of organizing the nation. We've been having these conferences all across the country. We have this report, we have the new pamphlet, and a great amount of outreach into every possible community who can confront the immediate danger and the immediate opportunity. So I guess my question to you is specifically, what can the Russian-American community do in this next month ahead, leading up to the conference, other than bringing people to the conference, other than getting people to sign on to the petition? Perhaps you could say more on that.
The Russian-American in particular?
Yes.
Let me answer it in a roundabout way. Anne brought up the perverse incentives which have led us to this brink of global thermonuclear war, from the military-industrial complex and so forth. There's an even far more perverse incentive, which is that if you look at the world from the perspective of the City of London, the financial center in London, and Wall Street, they're collapsing. They know they're collapsing. You can read the Financial Times in London, and they are very, very much aware that they have blown out their financial system. It's ready to completely collapse. They have no idea what to do because, of course, they're not willing to implement the Glass-Steagall Roosevelt solution to wipe out this speculative bubble. So they say, well, we have to print more money, or no, we have to commit more austerity, starve more people to death in Europe and America and around the world. But more than anything else, they say, look what's going on in the rest of the world. Russia and China and India, and really all the rest of the countries of Africa and South America and Asia, with very few exceptions, have finally stood up and said the West no longer cares about developing the world. The IMF and the World Bank will not lend money for infrastructure. They will only lend any money for anything with horrendous conditionalities of shutting down state sector industries, laying off public workers, ending subsidies for energy and things like this, contracting food, genocide. And they said, therefore, we're not going to stand this anymore. They don't want to destroy these Western financial institutions, but they said we have to do something else. And that's what the BRICS is. And when the City of London and Wall Street and their puppets, Cameron in England and Obama and the congressional lunatics here in Washington, or not here, I'm not in Washington anymore, down there where I live, upwind from the Washington so I can avoid the stench. But they see this, and the policy is, we must destroy this. We cannot allow these BRICS nations to come together and form a new world financial, economic, moral system. We cannot allow that. It will destroy us, and they're right. It will destroy them. And therefore, their policy is war. The threat of war on Russia has virtually nothing to do with Ukraine. Vladimir Putin this week said, if it hadn't been for Ukraine, they would have come up with another idea, because they cannot stand to see us grow and develop and to work collaboratively with the major nations of the world in a way which threatens their ability to steal raw materials, to impose policies, and to try to bail themselves out in a way which is impossible, by the way. You cannot bail out $4 quadrillion. It can't be done. They cannot be paid. If you killed every human being and took their gold out of their teeth, the way the Nazis did, you can't pay it. It has to be written off if civilization is going to survive. through Glass-Steagall methods. So the drive for war has to be identified for what it is. It's not only the greed of this country versus the greed of it's not geopolitics. Helga likes to say, and she's right, that Americans and Europeans simply cannot believe that the Chinese are not thinking the way they do, which is geopolitically. It's what's in it for us. They cannot believe that Vladimir Putin is not constantly driven like they are to think, how can I get the better of the other guys? They cannot believe that people think the way, in fact, all of Western civilization used to think when we had the Peace of Westphalia, when we had the idea of the nation state, the interests of the other, when that drove the idea of the nation state, and more than anything else, the creation of the United States, the city on the hill, the idea of the benefit of the general welfare of the population, our own and others. But they cannot imagine that anybody thinks like that because nobody in the West does anymore. And therefore, they're wrong. That is the way, as Helga said from her trip, she says that's the way they're thinking. They're thinking like American system people used to think. Now, in terms of how I think it's extremely important, what Daniel brought up, in America there are huge hyphenated American communities. Chinese, Russian, Indian. I think people here probably saw what happened when President Modi came here and spoke in New York at Madison Square Garden. I mean, this was a phenomenon all over the world. There were hundreds of thousands, millions of Indians in America, but all over the world who listened to this speech and were just inspired. My God, India can get out of its filth, its backwardness, its poverty, its starvation. As Tanu says, 400 million Indians with no electricity. We can solve that. And this optimism is what we have to grasp. It's much more difficult with the Russians because we've been through this, years and years and years of the Cold War where the Russians were the enemy image. And then they have to have an enemy. Ann pointed that out. They have to have an enemy to justify what they're doing. So they're building the enemy image of China and Russia. But I don't think you're going to, you can't address these communities by simply warning about the war danger. You have to go in there with this approach. This is what you have to do. You have to find a way to inspire their true human qualities, their optimism. Human beings are naturally optimistic because we're creative. We can think about what we want to happen in the future and how we make that future, not waiting to see how circumstances are going to change and affect our lives. We will make our future. And you have to inspire that, and this is the time to do it. I can't say anything more specific than that, but I think going to these hyphenated Americans is extremely important for the other Americans. We're a nation of hyphenated Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, Spanish Americans. So it's not just the current immigration problem or the Russians and the Chinese issue. This is what America is, the melting pot concept. So we have to convey that melting pot concept as a global phenomena, which is, if there's ever been a moment in history where it can be done, it's right now. And if there's ever been a moment where it absolutely must be done, it's right now.
Any other questions? There's one all the way in the back, it looks like. Okay. While Bob's walking back there, I'm sure he'd appreciate it if he knows where he has to go for the next question. Does anybody else have one?
Good afternoon. My question is for Ann Lee. First of all, do you have a website or a blog? Do you have a website or a blog?
I do. It's ProfessorAnnLee.com, spelled in one word. So ProfessorAnnlee.com.
Thank you. The second question is, I have heard 2 reports that China has several completely technologically modern ghost cities which are not populated. They're full of new empty apartments, new empty office buildings, new empty subways, new empty malls. Is this an economic boondoggle, or is this a new Chinese economic model?
So I'm quite aware of that. 60 Minutes actually did a whole show around this issue. And there are a couple things I want to say about that. One, when China basically unleashed capital or credit to their economy after the 2008 crisis, these were emergency funds that they had to put people back to work because over 20 million people lost their jobs when the financial crisis hit in 2008. And so China was basically desperately saying, okay, you guys just, do whatever it takes to get people back to work. And so people who were developers obviously were building things. And China may have built, one too many buildings ahead of time, but I have actually done the calculations in terms of how much real estate they had built, which was, I guess, the closest rough estimations were about 1 billion square feet that had been built there that needed absorption from the population. But if you assume that one person can occupy 100 square feet of space, whether it's retail or residential or whatever, you're going to absorb all that empty space in less than 10 years because of the huge populations that are still living in basically grass huts and other impoverished situations, because China, of over 1 billion people, still have like 500 million people that still need to be urbanized, and so they could easily move into these buildings. And so that's something where if the developers went bankrupt, then the Chinese government can take over and turn them into low-cost housing, low-income housing, and provide people with shelter. So it would actually be productively used if they chose to go that route. But the other thing is that a lot of the real estate that was built, they were already paid for in full by a lot of rich investors who made their money in China, but then decided they didn't want to put their money in a bank account where the interest rates on their deposits were, very low, like 3%. And they didn't want to put it into the stock market because the stock markets in China are still rather volatile and not institutionalized, and so you didn't have a lot of research analysts following companies and so forth. So it was still too volatile for their taste, and so they put their money into real estate. And so these ghost cities are ghost cities because a lot of these people bought the real estate and they kept them empty on purpose because they saw that these apartments would hold their value longer if they were brand new as opposed to being used, because there was no constant real estate tax there. And so that's part of the reason of what happened when you had these sort of incentives that are not aligned. And so the Chinese government has since realized, they have these issues and have talked about, reforming this real estate tax and other areas to try to make sure they don't create a real estate bubble. But I hope that answers your question in regards to that.
Can I add one little thing? Sure, go ahead. Thanks. I find that very interesting. I'm glad to hear that. But let me add one little piece, which is that the Chinese have not allowed the kind of mass derivative trade that we have here. And the reason we had the mortgage collapse here was because when the mortgages began to collapse, it wasn't just the value of the mortgage and the guy who owned the house. It's that that house was owned by 45 different people who had bought speculative mortgage, securitized mortgages. It was a bubble. There's no bubble in China. If they are bankrupt, as Ann Lee said, if these companies go bankrupt, they're going to lose. That's true. But all the people who hold securities in banks and things aren't going to lose, because this has not been turned into a big bubble based on the real house at the bottom of the pyramid. So therefore, the government can do, which is very interesting to hear, they could do, which is just take it over and do something useful with it. They have kept out this derivative, speculative insanity. They have not a Glass-Steagall bill exactly, but something like it, so that they don't allow the kind of domination of lunacy that you see in Europe and the United States financially.
We have time for 2 more questions. Well, actually, we have 3. Who's got the microphone? Oh, Bob, go to, I guess, over there.
Okay, I have 2 questions, and I might have missed something because I wasn't here for all the presentations, but I wanted to ask Anne about what we've seen when Modi was here, when the Prime Minister was here and he spoke, and part of the tremendous enthusiasm was that India had just achieved putting a rocket into the Mars orbit. And there was this great enthusiasm that Modi can communicate from the advanced science and the implication of that for India to the whole question of his cleanliness campaign. My question to you is what's happening in China around these tremendous advances around their move to mine helium-3 from the moon, their perspective on the space program, their fusion projects. How is that, what's the impact of that in the population in China, as well as the larger implication of that? And then I have a second question, which is a little bit different, but I wanted to ask about the foreign policy of the BRICS around their insistence that the idea of regime change and these kinds of policies are abhorrent to their idea of development.
I got to interrupt this.
Those are my
just because
questions.
the problem is this. I don't want to have, we only have a total of 8 minutes, okay, for more questions. So we can take one of those questions, the first one, and then we had a second person down here, I think, that had a question. I can't quite see it right there. Okay. Go ahead and ask.
A question for Dennis. I've been involved in the LaRouche movement for a while. Is there a political story to be told about this event being held at Columbia University?
Let's go first to your, why don't you take your question first? Yeah.
So regarding what the impact of science and research on China's population is, I would say it's enormous. I documented in my book that China has a 10-year talent development program in place in which they've been actively going around the world recruiting the best scientists, the best researchers, the top in every industry to come to China and to give them whatever they need to do their research. So they provide them with amazing labs, lots of funding. They could hire whoever they want. And this is in part China's effort to really put a lot of support in research and pushing the limits and creating innovation there. And so China has been making all kinds of strides, not just in space, but in biotech, in water technology. I mean, they're on the bleeding edge of a lot of this, mostly because it's, necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And we heard about how they have water shortages, they have pollution problems, and so they have to solve these problems in real time, and therefore they're putting all their best minds at work. And I had also made an example in my book about in biotech. Whereas, one of my good friends, Kristen Baldwin, she is a neuroscientist at Scripps College out in San Diego. She was the first American to publish in Nature magazine, Nature Journal, which is a very highly regarded science journal, how she was able to take regular skin cells, not stem cells, skin cells, and turn them into mice. Interestingly enough, the Chinese team had beat her by 2 weeks. And they published them simultaneously online and in the journal. And she said that the difference between China and the U.S. is that is $1 billion, because after their scientists published this, the Chinese government was so thrilled they gave their researchers $1 billion to continue more research. And she, my friend Kristen, has not received a single dime from NIH.
Somebody, I'm sorry, I have my reading glasses on, I can't quite see anyway. I'll take my thing at the end. Take that person there, and then we'll...
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's my second time attending a conference like this. I recently joined LaRouche. And my question is, so we keep talking about America, but what is Canada's position in regards to joining BRICS? Would it be easier or more difficult to get them to join? And do you think that they'd simply follow in the footsteps of the US?
Mike, you just had a thing up there yesterday. Why don't you... She probably doesn't know. Just tell her.
Well, you obviously have a very severe problem in Canada with your political leadership. I wouldn't even want to begin comparing the American and Canadian political leadership because, I mean, they're equally horrendous. What the Prime Minister in Canada is calling for is virtually going to war with both China and Russia. That's their policy. I mean, it might not put it quite that way. But I will say, yesterday, before I came up here, the group in Montreal held a diplomatic meeting. I don't think we're at liberty to say who attended because it was off the record. But I can tell you it was a very, very high-level delegation of ambassadors and high-level embassy people who came with great interest. And one of them, I will say, after a long discussion and a back and forth about the Silk Road and what's happening in Asia and the importance of this to save mankind, said he'd already seen the report. Here, let me grab this report. He said he had already seen this report because his embassy in Washington had sent it to him immediately, and he said it's already a classic. So, So I don't think there's any real difference. I mean, we're dealing here, when we say why the United States must join the BRICS, I'm not sure that even was the best title. It's why the transatlantic nations, Europe and America, must, and Canada, of course, must join the BRICS. It's this false division of the East versus the West, where the West right now is destroying itself and threatening to destroy the world. And they must come together with this American system impulse in Europe, in the BRICS.
So we're about to close with song, and I guess maybe that's the easiest way to talk about the issue of Colombia and our presence here. Yes, it's true that those of us associated with Lyndon LaRouche, haven't been to Colombia for a while. I think Ira Leibowitz is here. He's one of the veterans of those days. But those days were a time of the anti-war movement. And I guess it should be said that we're talking about the spring of 1968. And it was a much different United States. It was the United States in which it was possible to engage in a kind of discourse, as I've emphasized to a few people in the last several days, in which great ideas were thought to be able to move the world. But one of the reasons we thought that was because there were people who were willing to actually stand up and give their lives for those ideas. They didn't think that that was not only not a waste, they often did that with great courage. In the two selections we're going to sing, hear and sing, Deep River and then Rally Round the Flag. The reason we think we have the right to sing these things, though they would seem to be, in talking about the United States so much, highly patriotic, is because we understand Alexander Hamilton's United States. That was a revolutionary United States. That was an anti-colonial United States. That was a United States of discoverers and inventors, of scientists like Ben Franklin, and revolutionaries like Alexander Hamilton. And so, that's the United States we represent, just as some people in 1968 tried to represent that United States. Yes, we attacked the Vietnam War, and yes, we became very controversial for doing so, and yes, there were shall we say, intense debates that sometimes became, shall we say, rather calorically active, I'll put it that way. But at the same time, the whole point was to actually get to the point that we, the people of the United States, would stand up to a tradition that we knew we all came from. And so I think that's the most important thing to say about us being here. And we're happy that we're here. And I think Malcolm X is happy that we're here. And I think that's enough to be said. And I'd like to now introduce our chorus. And we're going to do first Deep River and then the final ending of our conference today. Rally around the flag.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag. once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We are springing to the call of our brothers gone before, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll fill our vacant ranks with 1,000,000 free men more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will welcome to our numbers the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although they may be poor, not a man shall be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. So we're springing to the call from the east and from the west, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll hurl the rebel crew from the land we love the best, shouting the battle cry of freedom.